Hello, hi, welcome. This session is about building your family with a sperm donor. And we'd like to thank the sponsor of this session, California Cyrobank, for supporting this conversation. And thanks to our audience for joining us. You can go to fertilityplanet.com to find speaker bios, Twitter handles, and to book appointments with any of our speakers. It's my pleasure to introduce Scott Brown, Director of Client Experience and Communications. And here we are.
Thank you very much. Really happy to be here. Welcome to everybody here in the audience. We're going to talk about starting your family using donor semen today and some of the important aspects of it that aren't necessarily the first things that people think about. We have Dr. Catherine de Ugarte here, who's going to talk about some of the important medical aspects and things to think about as we travel down this road. And then Diane Goodman, who's a legal expert in family law, and particularly in LGBT family forming, and talk about some of the important legal things that don't necessarily come to mind right away. I am from California Cryobank. We are here in Los Angeles. We do recruit donors all over the country and ship all over the world. So don't feel like questions should be limited to what you can do locally, or if you're watching online and have questions, we can get sperm to you no matter where you are, basically. To start off, I thought I'd really start at the very beginning, which is preparation. The thing that people consider when starting their families usually second and third steps down the road. But there's a couple things that you can do ahead of time, particularly when you're starting to use donor sperm, to guarantee that, not guarantee, there are no guarantees, but to help the process along. And because you're going to be spending a lot of money, and because it's going to be more involved than traditional conception, there's some preparation that you should go through, starting from a medical point of view. So, Dr. de Ugarte, could you talk about some of the important aspects of pre-insemination medical care they should think about?
Thank you, and thank you for letting me be here, because I think this is a very important topic that I talk to my patients a lot about. When I have a patient who comes in who requires sperm donation, I always go through the steps of how to pick a donor, what kind of donor, known versus anonymous donor, and what are the steps to get pregnant in terms of the workup, and how do we actually get patients pregnant. So one of the most important things that I talk to them about is, number one, is, are you ready to get pregnant? And most of my patients say no. And then I tell them, well, you know what, I wasn't ready when I got pregnant. There's never a good time to have a baby. So obviously you have to just jump on in, kind of like dive into the pool. And there's always challenges in our lives, and we all have things going on, but you just have to do it. And so once they've made that big step, which sometimes takes a month or a year or 3 years to get there. Once they get there, then they're like, now what? Where do we go? And so I give them names of sperm banks, of where to look. I tell them, you can either just pick online, or they can do an in-person. I know you guys have that, where you can actually go there and be like, this is what I want. I want somebody who's this many feet tall and this personality, and goes to Harvard Medical School, and everybody gets very picky. And I always kind of go through them about what criteria to go through, and I've actually helped some of my good friends and patients go through the different criteria online, and found some really amazing donors. In fact, I remember I helped my best friends with it last summer, and we were ready to just go park outside your cryobank and look for this guy for her as a dating guy. But most of all, I also go through the process based on their age. How realistic is it that they'll get pregnant? Doesn't always happen on the first try. Sometimes it does. Doesn't always, depending on the age. Obviously, the older the woman is, the longer it may take. I've had patients who get pregnant on the first try. I've had patients who get pregnant on the 9th try. That's the most I've seen somebody who had to do 9 inseminations, actually for insurance reasons. Her insurance wouldn't let her do IVF unless she did 1 more IUI, and that actually she got pregnant on her 9th IUI, which is kind of funny, but she did it. So, and then I also go through the workup, because they're technically not infertility patients. So these patients, most of them have never tried. Some have, but most of them have never tried to get pregnant before. And so I tell them, you're not technically an infertility patient, so some of the infertility studies in terms of pregnancy rates may not apply to you, But if you look at just studies that were done out there with just sperm donors and ages, I think those are really good French studies that were done. I go through all the pregnancy statistics, and to be realistic that it may or may not happen on the first try. And also through the workup, I always recommend doing at least the blood tests, make sure there's no hormonal disorders such as thyroid issues, which are very common before they embark, if they have irregular periods, if they have a history of things like endometriosis or other things that can block their tubes. I do recommend getting their tubes checked to make sure the tubes are open before doing an insemination procedure. And then after doing a few insemination procedures and it doesn't work, then I continue the workup further. I don't keep going endlessly. We always have a plan after each time, and we talk about medications or not.
When people are using donor sperm, I have a lot of clients who are thinking about doing at-home inseminations themselves. You wouldn't pull your own teeth, but I don't even like changing the battery in my car. But if you want to try an at-home insemination, go for it. But so, what are some of realistically the pros and cons? The basic cost of maybe using a physician for an IUI. I mean, what are some of the reasons people might choose to try it at home versus with a physician, and what are maybe the success rates, or even though we're talking about very different scenarios depending on age and health and lots of different things, what are some reasons to consider physician versus at home? Like, how's the process different between an IUI and an ICI?
First of all, the home inseminations, I personally don't recommend, but I'm okay with patients trying it a few times if they want to. I've had several patients who've tried it, and at least I try to help them, guide them to at least do it at the right time, because you want to make sure you time it, because with frozen sperm, it doesn't live as long as with fresh sperm. So you really want to time it perfectly with ovulation. Sometimes we even do trigger shots to make sure that they time it perfectly at home, because ovulation kits aren't so perfect. The lines, I remember having done them myself, the little lines are so confusing. It's a little darker or a little darker than the day before, and it's confusing. So timing is important. And also the way you do it, they think turkey baster. And honestly, if you've ever seen a sperm vial, it will not work with a turkey baster, because the turkey baster is humongous. And first of all, you can't even get the sperm out of there. So I've actually, even though you're not technically supposed to, I've even given some of them like a syringe to try, because they wouldn't even know what kind of syringe, where do you buy one, what size, how would you even get the sperm out of the little vial, where do you put it in the microwave to warm it? I mean, you'd be surprised what people do. You don't do that. So I actually talk to them how to do it properly, and I give them the correct syringe, because I don't even know where I would tell them to go buy the correct syringe, because a lot of times it's hard to do otherwise.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference between an ICI and an IUI insemination and what that really means?
Yeah, so ICI is basically intracervical insemination, where you would put the sperm in the cervix. So people doing it at home usually are really kind of doing an intravaginal insemination. Very few actually have speculums and actually can get the sperm in there in the actual cervix. So a lot of them are doing IVIs. But we in the office, we put the sperm intrauterine insemination, so we actually get it in with a little catheter directly into the uterus, so it doesn't have to ask for directions. We get it in there closer to the eggs, because the cervix kills a lot of the sperm.
By design, your body actually is trying to prevent sperm, because it's a foreign body, from getting where you want it to get. So the IUI actually allows you to get the sperm right to where it needs to be, versus hoping that it can make that journey, which doesn't look like a lot, but that's like walking from here to San Francisco. I mean, it's a long way to go for the sperm, and they have to actually get through some pretty serious defenses. It certainly is a viable option to do at-home inseminations, and it's something that people can do. It's something that I always recommend against. It's not that it doesn't technically work, and if you look at the studies on an ICI versus an IUI, they're fairly close in terms of success rates. However, those studies are done in physician offices. So as Dr. DeArte said, if you put it in the right place, if you use the speculum, thank you, and you actually perform it 100% accurately, your chances are pretty good. However, the chances of doing it correctly aren't necessarily so good. I mean, it's a move, versus going to a physician who will bring the sperm farther along in the process, who will use ultrasound to guide them through, who will know that the sperm is being aspirated out of the vial properly, that all the sperm is actually making it in there, there's no spillage. And that the timing is important. She mentioned timing, and it's critical in this process, particularly as you get into your later 20s, 30s, and early 40s, that your window of opportunity to get pregnant is very small in closing. And so you don't have, 5 days where you can inject a sperm and then wait. You really have a 24 to 72-hour window that the sperm has to find that egg. And if the sperm gets there too late, if the egg's already come through and dropped out of the fallopian tube, you're out of luck. If it gets there too early, the sperm can die before the egg actually ever finds it. So it's really about timing when it comes down to everything, and that's something the physician can really help you with and make sure that you're accurate with. And that's what we're really talking about. It's not age, but all that stuff is important. Egg quality, sperm quality, it's all important. But if you don't get that timing right, it doesn't matter if you have the Michael Phelps of sperm and the
golden speculum.
Golden speculum. It's not going to help you at that point. I want to jump over here to Diane for a moment and talk about some of the important aspects, particularly in same-sex parenting, and what you should think about as you start to prepare down this road, because there are some issues that become very important later on in life that you want to consider at the beginning of the process to help you along, and both between the two partners, and then also if you're considering using a known donor versus an anonymous donor through a sperm bank. Diane?
The first thing, now I'm on. The first thing is I'm a big proponent, if you're not married, you don't do it at home. In California, we have Family Code Section 7613 that states if you use a known donor and you do it at home without the assistance of a doctor, that donor could be found to be a parent. And if you are using a known donor and you do it through a doctor, then the donor by law is not a parent. And if you want your donor to be a parent, then you have to do a contract saying, and you're using a doctor, you have to do a contract saying, I want my donor to be a parent. Otherwise, the default is your donor is not a parent if you use a doctor. And if you don't use a doctor, the default is the donor is possibly a parent. So if you want your donor to be a donor and not to be a parent, you need to use a doctor. And you need to have a contract between you and the donor that specifies what you're doing and that you're using a doctor. But I'm adamant with clients that you're really setting yourself up for legal risks and thousands of dollars in legal fees if you and your donor have a misunderstanding somewhere down the line if you don't use a doctor. And you have better protections using a doctor. So I think that's where I start the conversation.
It's a good place to start. There are also, beyond the legal ramifications, emotional issues that can arise with a known donor in terms of his position changing on how involved he wants to be with the child, either more or less as the child gets older. He has a family. He has parents. How do they feel about your child that you don't really consider necessarily their grandchild? However, they do consider it their grandchild. If you haven't properly set up second parent adoption laws, second parent adoption to guarantee the rights of the non-birth mother, what can that mean in terms of an unfortunate accident or death to the birth mother? Who steps in as the legal guardian of that child? There are a lot of issues to consider. They're not any of them necessarily deal breakers, but they're all things that you've got to think about at the beginning of the process. Can you talk a little bit about donor contract, known donor contract?
Sure. When I do donor contracts, we specify that the donor has no parental rights. We make it clear that the donor doesn't have a right to inherit from the child doesn't have a right to inherit from the donor. The donor has no obligations to pay child support. Many of you may have heard of the case in Kansas where they didn't have a donor agreement and the donor got hit for child support. So we specify, again, that the donor has no obligations and no rights. So that's no right to be a parent and no right to visit. And I make sure that, in many of my cases, the donors are visiting, and sometimes they're even called daddy. But we put in the contract that they don't have any parental rights, and any occasional contact doesn't make them a parent. And then the other thing that I recommend to all clients is doing either a second parent adoption or a step parent adoption, depends on what state you live in and whether you're married or not, if you're in a marriage recognition state. But that you also get a court order that the two intended parents, in our case the two mothers, would be the legal parents and that the donor is not a parent, so that there's no misunderstandings anywhere in the future.
You referenced Kansas, and there are other stories out there in the news about donors and met through Craigslist or things like that. Any bad story you hear about donor conception is a known donor. you don't have any issues when you use a sperm bank. And I'm not saying you have to use California Cryobank, but when you follow the law is actually very clear on the do's and don'ts of these situations. So as long as you do your homework and do things the right way, your parental rights are completely protected. However, when you miss it even by a little bit, that's when things can become sticky and complicated. And even so much as if you live in a state where same-sex marriage is honored, but then the birth parent takes the child to a state where same-sex marriage is not honored, you will no longer have rights as a parent if you're the non-birth parent. So when you do a second parent adoption, that guarantees your rights no matter what state you're in, and make sure that everyone has nothing but the best intentions. Unfortunately, half of all relationships, or whatever the statistics are now, don't work out the way we intend. You want to plan for hope for the best case scenario and plan for the worst case scenario. And doing simple things like preparation at the beginning can save you a lot of heartache down the line.
Right. I recommend my clients, whether they're using a known donor or an unknown donor from a cryobank, do a legal consultation as part of the process of getting pregnant. One of the things that's important to know is the U.S. Constitution, our full faith and credit clause, requires that we recognize other states' court orders. So even a non-marriage recognition state has to recognize a court order of parentage that comes from any state that finds two women to be the parents of the child. So in California, if you're married or if you're registered domestic partners, both women can go on the birth certificate at the time the child is born. But that birth certificate may not be recognized in another state. Other states don't have to recognize our birth certificates. It's kind of like my license to practice law. I can't practice in another state. It's up to that state to decide what their criteria is to recognize me as a lawyer. And the same thing with a birth certificate. It's a form of a license. It's not something that has to be recognized. But if you go to court and do an adoption, which is, I think, the most recognized form that we have in other states, all other states will have to recognize it under the federal constitution. And so far, all the test cases where it's come up, those non-marital recognition states have recognized court orders of parentage. So it's important to do that even if you're in California and you're married or you're registered domestic partners and you can both go on the birth certificate. It's still important to also go and get a court order. So not only if you break up and parent takes the child to another state, but also if your child ends up in the hospital in another state and you need to make medical decisions. There's other states that have, problems of who they let into a hospital room and who they consider a parent. You also have protection from those third parties. And so even if your relationship is stable and you're not worried about your partner leaving you and going to a non-recognition state, you may vacation in one, and it's important to have court orders that protect you if you go to those states.
I just had a question. You could just kind of nod. We don't have to do a show of hands, but are anyone here considering using a known donor or somebody that they're familiar with? Or okay, well, thank you. So one of the things that you particularly want to do as you go down that road is have that donor worked up. It's also actually part of the law too that if that donor comes to a sperm bank and has a sperm analysis done, we do family medical history, STD testing, you then quarantine that specimen for 6 months and retest the donor again to make sure he's not carrying anything that we missed. That will actually add another layer of protection on top of using a physician for the insemination, and also guarantees protecting your health and the health of your future child. So it's something to definitely think about. There are costs associated with that. It's usually in the anywhere between $1,500 and $3,000, depending on how many collections you want to do. Because if you're hoping to have a second child somewhere down the line, you want to consider getting all your vials collected now. Otherwise, you're going through this same process again in a couple years. And if that donor moves away or changes his mind or his health status changes, you may not have the ability to get specimens from him. So let's just get them all now, put them through the one process, only pay for it one time, and then leave them in storage. So an important thing to think about.
And I put that in the contract also. So when I do a donor agreement, one of the things we talk about is the donor willing to have his sperm used for more than one child, and whatever sperm is frozen belongs to the intended parents, not to the donor. And also what can be done with that sperm when you're done with it. Or if you create embryos, then what happens with those embryos if you're going to end up doing IVF, so that you don't have to go back to that donor for more information or get that donor's permission if you say you're done and you want to destroy the sperm so that you don't have to pay storage charges at the cryobank any longer. And I know you have a lot of stored materials that
We do. What are some of the basic costs of, let's say, a donor contract and a second parent or step parent adoption?
Donor contracts tend to run between $750 and $1,000. Adoptions, depending on whether you're married or registered domestic partners and can do it as a step parent, or if you're an unmarried couple, for whatever reasons, choose not to marry, it's more expensive. Your home study fees, if you're married, are $700. If you're unmarried, your home study fees are $4,500. They don't actually come out to the house in a step parent home study, but we still call it that, I think, just because. The legal fees run around $2,500 to $3,000.
And what's it cost for a custody battle?
$100,000.
There you go.
Or more.
Let's bounce back to the medical side of it a little bit. So you mentioned IVF, and I'm sure everyone here is familiar at least with the term. Can you talk about the difference between the procedure, the IVF procedure versus, let's say, an IUI, and then cost factors as they apply?
Sure. If somebody comes to me for the first time and they've never, ever gotten pregnant, very unlikely that we would jump right to IVF, unless there was a genetic reason, like if they had a specific genetic mutation and their partners or their donor happened to be the same genetic mutation, which is very unlikely, that we would jump right to IVF. So most of my patients go through a series of insemination, which is a lot less costly. In our clinic, an insemination, for example, is $850, but a lot of times it's covered by insurance. I have several patients who get covered for either 3 or 6 inseminations, or they have a certain amount that's covered by insurance. So, and it's interesting, I've had several patients this year that their insurance covers IVF, but not insemination, which I thought was interesting. I've had at least 3 patients this year, or they'll cover 3 cycles of insemination and IVF, no matter how many of each you do. But then on the other hand, I've had patients who have to go through a certain number of insemination before IVF's covered. So obviously insurance is important. If insurance is covered, obviously insemination's great. If it's not covered, insemination's obviously a lot less expensive. It's like $850 versus anywhere from $7,000 to $10,000 for an IVF cycle. And it's obviously, but it's a lot more successful depending on the age.
Yeah, so what are the success rates?
So if you take like a 35-year-old who comes for an insemination and she's not using any medications and she's healthy and otherwise things look good, her chances of getting pregnant with an insemination is the same chance as if she was having intercourse at the right time of the cycle, which would be anywhere from 10 to 15% per month. If she was doing in vitro fertilization with the lab technology getting better and better, I'd say that she had more like a 50 to 70% chance of getting pregnant, and also the chance of freezing embryos for future use.
And so as the patient gets older, those odds shift dramatically in the IUI, but for the IVF, they actually stay pretty consistent.
Not necessarily.
Right?
I would say, for example, a 40-year-old has about a 5% chance per month of getting pregnant with an insemination, but with IVF, I'd say it's 20-25%. So it's still higher with IVF, but it gets smaller. In fact, if you're like 45, you pretty much have a 1% chance no matter which way you go, if so. That 1% is actually even good. I've had, honestly, in my 10 years of doing this, I've had one 45-year-old that got pregnant with IVF with her own eggs, and one 46-year-old with IUI. That's been my experience. I'm sure guys in the back have more than just one in each category, but it does happen, but rarely. Unfortunately, we don't see a lot of 45-year-olds that get pregnant with their own eggs, no matter what they do.
And is it, in general, the age of the woman, the eggs, the age of the uterus? Like, what's the big factor to overcome if you're 40 plus trying to get pregnant?
Definitely the ovaries, the age of the woman is the most important factor, no matter what you do. Obviously, uterus is important, but it doesn't matter really how old the woman is most of the times. That it's the ovaries that age very quickly.
So if you go to an egg donor at that point, your odds actually increase back up to what they would have been when you were the age of the egg donor?
Most patients who are, let's say 45, have about, for 50 to 70% chance of getting pregnant with a young egg donor.
So you've decided to use an anonymous donor. What does that mean? How does that process work? What are costs involved? This is where California Cryobank or Fairfax or Seattle Sperm Bank or one of the other handful of accredited registered sperm banks in the United States come in. First and foremost, my advice to you would be do your homework, find the bank that is right for you. That can include what kind of accreditation they have, making sure that they're fully licensed, accredited, and inspected by the FDA, by the AATB, American Association of Tissue Banks, CLIA, following the guidelines of the ASRM, American Society of Reproductive Medicine. All that information should be available on their websites, or you can call in and ask. If it's a bank you're finding on a general search, if it's coming up in the top, it's probably okay, but always ask those questions because it's very important. There's also questions about limitations on offspring per donor. Every bank is in charge of making their own rules. Most are adhering to similar guidelines to California Cryobank. One of the important aspects is not only what their current guidelines are, but what they were, say, 10 years ago, because you may choose a donor who's been available for some time, and just because they're saying 25 to 30 families worldwide now doesn't mean that that donor hasn't already had 40 families use him over the last 10 years. I can speak for California Cryobank very confidently in telling you that we've been limiting the number of offspring for quite some time. We're the only sperm bank when you go on a public site like the Donor Sibling Registry, which is a place where families can go to find half-siblings through donor conception, that we don't have the stories you hear of the 50, 75, 100 kids per donor because the owners of our company, and I'm very proud of this, we're fortunate enough to have the foresight to limit offspring numbers way back when. Doing that means limiting the number of vials you collect and distribute. One of the reasons you want to use a larger national bank that has a wider recruiting base is because we can afford to keep donors in the program for a shorter amount of time. The process of working up a sperm donor is very expensive. When you pay $750 for a vial of sperm, you're not paying the $750 for that sperm, you're paying for the 99% of the guys that didn't clear the screening process to get you to that one donor. So we have donors who fall out because of specimen quality, because of genetic testing, because of STD testing, because of family medical history, because of social activity. There's a whole list of reasons that the guys get eliminated. That all is built into the cost of the vial that you're purchasing. So you want to understand what that process is with each bank, understand what their standards are, not only the objective standards of specimen quality count, things like that, and the STD testing, but there's also a subjective element to it. And all our donor coordinators, not by design, but happen to be female. And we give them sort of a carte blanche to say, you know what, this guy's 6'2", he's got a PhD, he's good looking, he's got great baby photos, he's a great writer, he loved his grandmother, but he just creeps me out. There's just something about this guy that I can't put my finger on it. I got a bad feeling. That eliminates the guy from the program. Number one, he's going to be around for about a year, and we don't want to force our team to work with people that they don't want to work with. But more importantly, 18, 20, 25 years down the line, guys don't get less creepy as they get older generally. They get more creepy. Present company excluded, of course. So we just want to make sure that potentially if there is going to be a contact between the family and the donor, that we can at least confidently say at this point that we think that would be a good thing, that we would be proud to help facilitate and do our best to protect the interests of you and your children. That sort of brings me to the next topic, which is types of donors that are available. So in general, you have the known donor, which we've talked a lot about, that would happen outside of a sperm bank, somebody that you know, potentially a family member, a friend, colleague, things like that. Sperm banks have different types of donors they offer as well. We have the traditional anonymous donor, which is that the donor has no intent of being involved in the child's life, any parental rights, responsibilities, really is doing this as an altruistic, financially incentivized donation and isn't necessarily looking to be part of your child's life someday. It doesn't mean that once your child turns 18 and contacts the cryobank that we won't reach out to that donor and ask for him to make contact, and that contact would be facilitated by us, between both parties, protecting both parties' anonymity and privacy. But there's no obligation to it. He's basically saying, like, you're donating blood or anything else, I'm donating sperm, I'm hoping to do a good thing for the world, I'm hoping to help families, but this is where my involvement will end most likely. We also offer what we call open donors. It's basically the exact same scenario, except that that donor is committing to a minimum of one contact facilitated again by CCB once the child turns 18. You can't request it, your family can't request it, your mother can't request it, your child can't request it until they're 18. When they do so, we will contact the donor, your child will send us a letter, an email, 20 years from now a hologram, I don't know, whatever they have then, right? It used to be a phone call until email came along. And we will then forward that to the donor. The donor responds. Oftentimes, that relationship can blossom into more. It can be personal contact directly between the donor and the child. Sometimes it's just a response from the donor that says, answers the questions the child asks, but basically says, I'm glad to have heard from you, but I have my life, I have my family, you have your life, you have your parents. I'm so glad to have been able to be in contact, but this is as much as I can do, and I wish you nothing but the best. And it's not always the answer the kids are looking for, but it's honest and it's direct, and at least it provides some kind of closure for them. Anonymous donors can have the same response. Anonymous relationships can be carried on far beyond just the messages back and forth. It can become a much more personal thing. That's going to be at the discretion of the donor, the child, and you. Some sperm banks offer ID release programs, which basically means once your child turns 18, they'll turn over the donor's name and last known address to you, and you're kind of on your own. We don't happen to believe in that. We don't think that that's the best course of action. I think it's important to manage expectations. I think it's even more important that you protect everybody involved, both the donor and the families. I have a young daughter, and if she had been donor conceived, the last thing I would want to do is have her turn 18 and hop on a plane to fly across the country to meet some guy no one's talked to in 15 years. I just don't think that's a safe thing to do, and I don't think that her expectations would necessarily be met. They can be rejected outright. It can be disappointment. It can be very painful, and it just, as much as the idea of having access to that donor sounds like a good thing now, it's really something you have to seriously consider because you just don't know what that donor's reaction is going to be and how it will affect your family. I really want people to think about that, and I stress to them that tracking down your donor on your own, there was an MTV show recently, Generation Cryo, some of you may have seen, where some kids actually went through the process of tracking their donor down. It can have really painful results for everybody. It's just something to think about and something to seriously consider before you pursue that course. That's sort of jumping ahead in the whole process. Let's back it up a little bit to talk a little bit about the donor selection process. How does it work? What can you get? What can you do? What can you know? A lot of this can be done online, almost all of it. If you never wanted to talk to us, you wouldn't have to. I highly recommend calling in and talking to our client service reps. They're great. Calling, talking to me, anybody else in the company. Basically, we're recruiting high-achieving, scholastically accomplished, healthy, strong candidates that we think will be desirable to people as donors. We do have a height requirement of 5'9" for Caucasian donors. It's not that short guys aren't great. It's that you don't want short guys. That's what you've told us over 35 years of doing this. So we require 5'9" or taller. We have age requirements. That's 19 to 38. That's based on the fact that studies have shown that men over 40 have a higher rate of birth defect. We want to make sure that we stay within those guidelines. The majority of donors are really in their mid-20s. It's usually after they've graduated from college, but before their careers have really taken off. We do recruit in Cambridge, Massachusetts, New York, here in Los Angeles, and also Northern California. So we're getting guys from Harvard, MIT, UCLA, USC, NYU, Columbia. I mean, we're strategically placed in those areas because that's where we think the best universities are. And so we hope to bring high-achieving, scholastic-minded individuals into the program. We do require they be graduated from or enrolled in a four-year university. Again, it's not that there's not really smart, spectacular guys at junior college. It's just that our client base has told us that education is important and intelligence is important, so we want to use that as a screening criteria for the donors. We do look at 3 generations of family medical history. You will have access to all that information. Looking for high incidences of early onset heart disease, cancer, any other genetic disease that we can determine and weed out if possible. We do genetic testing. You can look at the detailed specifics on the website. Basically, we're looking for things that are highly occurring in the general population, frequency of more than 1 per 50 individuals, things like cystic fibrosis, spinal muscular atrophy, Tay-Sachs disease, thalassemia. If you are a carrier of anything that we don't screen for, actually, even if you're a carrier of something we do screen for, it's good to talk to our genetic counselors and talk about potential risks. We can do additional testing on donors that is at your cost, but important to know that if you're a carrier of something we're not screening for, the donor is not also a carrier as well. Then you get into the fun stuff. Then you get into the actual height, weight, eye color, hair color, ethnic background, interests, likes, dislikes. We offer childhood photo series, so you can take a look at the donor from age, say, a year old through 11 years old. We have audio interviews you can listen to. I happen to think that it's really one of the most interesting and personal ways to get to know the donor. One of the things that we've determined over the last few years is that the majority of our clients now are single mothers by choice and same-sex couples. And their criteria for choosing a donor is slightly different than what the traditional heterosexual couple was looking for. Back in the 80s and into the early 90s, when the majority of our clients were husbands and wives, they really just wanted a match for dad, right? They wanted a guy who was the same ethnic background, height, weight, eye color, and everything else didn't really matter much as long as they were a physical match to dad. Well, what happens when you convert that to single women and lesbian couples is that suddenly there becomes an emotional component. Who is this individual? What kind of person is he? How do we identify with him? How do we connect to him? Because someday, very early on, we're going to have a conversation with our child about who the donor was and why we chose this donor. And I want to be able to say more than, well, he was tall. And I want to be able to give the child something to latch on to understand maybe more about themselves that they're not seeing in your eyes. And that can be stuff about his interests, his hobbies, if he's an artist, a poet, an actor, the types of music that he listens to. We have these guys do sort of this open-ended thing we call Express Yourself, which is a blank sheet of paper that they can do anything they want to with. They can give us an essay or original poetry or lists of, like, when I'm in this kind of mood, I listen to this music. Anything they want that sort of differentiates them from the pack to show us who they are as individuals, because we believe that our clients are looking to know who they are as individuals. We also have some sort of fun stuff like our donor celebrity lookalike program, which is basically all our donors get assigned lookalikes. And it's not necessarily always Brad Pitt and Leonardo DiCaprio. It's who we really think they look like. And the point is not that your child will turn out looking like John Stamos someday. The point is that 5'9", brown hair, green eyes can look like a lot of different things. And we just want to give you a better sense and a better idea of what that look is, because we think it helps identify the donor and give you more of a 3D personalized context to place him into. There's tons of medical information. The screening process, as I mentioned, is really, I wouldn't make it for a number of reasons, age notwithstanding. And most guys wouldn't. 99% of the applicants are disqualified for a variety of reasons. Rest assured that when you are choosing a donor, there's no wrong choices. It's just about what's right for you. And when you narrow it down, I think you both have worked with a lot of donor patients and clients, at the end of the day, the baby that you end up with is the baby that you were meant to have. And I've been doing this for almost 10 years now. I've never had a single client call me up after their baby was born and say, you know what? I wish I'd have gone with 1, 2, 3, 4. I knew it. This kid looks funny. It's squishy. Money back guarantee. If you're not happy with your child, we'll take it back, okay? I'll give you a free vial. Next one's on me. It never works out that way. So have fun with it. Engage in the process. Look through it all. Have your donor selection parties where you invite your girlfriends over and sit around and you write all the pros and cons. You'll learn more about your girlfriends than you will about the donor. I guarantee you that. Enjoy the process, but don't stress about it. You can't possibly make a wrong choice. All the specimen quality is there. Every donor gives you the exact same chance of success. That doesn't vary donor to donor. Because one guy has reported pregnancies and one guy doesn't yet have reported pregnancies is totally irrelevant. He will eventually. It's just a numbers game. How long has he been available? How many people have tried? Don't get hung up on that. There's enough stress and there's enough things to think about in this process to not let that part of it bog you down. With that said, we have two very, I don't know how to say it, but two guests who are going to come up and join us. I'm trying to think how to tell this story without totally tipping it off, but Courtney and CJ, who are going to come up, were at Fertility Planet last year and had a really good experience. And maybe I'll let them tell you a little more than that, but I think they are going to lend a really great perspective to this process and be able to answer some questions, and then we'll open it up to the floor to any questions for anybody. We have 5, 10 minutes? Okay, we have 5 or 10 minutes. So
6 minutes.
6 minutes, okay. Courtney and CJ, you guys, your mics on? You good? Mike's on?
Yep.
Yes, yes. So why don't you tell us about last year to start?
So we had 8 unsuccessful IUIs, and the doctor we had at the time said maybe you guys should try IVF. And so we went home, and I searched the internet, and the very next weekend was the Fertility Planet. So we're like, okay, let's go. So we went down and went through the vendor booths, sat through some of these type of situations, these speaking sessions, and we met Dr. Diagarde and talked with her, and she's like, hey, I'm getting ready to go speak. Why don't you come in and watch me speak? We're like, okay. So we sat through the session. Afterwards, we talked with her a little bit, and she's like, why don't you come to my office and, talk. And in 6 weeks, our baby girl's going to be born, Cameron. So it was a very successful conference for us. We learned a lot of things that we've been trying for about 3 years through IUIs. So when we came to the conference, we thought we were know-it-alls, and we definitely were not.
Not even close.
So we learned a lot of stuff, made a great connection with Dr. Diagarde, actually used a sperm donor from California Chirobank. And
yeah, we met you guys here too. The vendors.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm telling you, it was a great conference
it
last
was.
year.
It was.
We'd used them for all our other IUIs. And donor selection, I want to just kind of go off of what you were talking about. Don't stress about it because there's a lot of stresses going on through this process. The one thing you don't need in your life is stress. And it really doesn't matter. We had our top 5 picked. She had her favorite one. I had my favorite one. And we purchased the Donor Conversations. That is by far what swayed us. We listened to their voice, listened to their answers, and we were like, absolutely not. This guy is a dork. And it was my top choice.
Or creep, like you said.
Or a creep, You get a lot from not seeing a face and hearing someone's voice, hearing how, they answer things, you can get someone's personality on how they talk. So I would say our number one thing that swayed us on a donor was the conversation.
Great. So I just want to point out this is officially, I think we checked this with Karen Thayer, this is officially the first Fertility Planet baby.
Yes.
Right here. So.
Thank you.
Were there any sort of things you guys wish you'd done differently, or was there any just like, oh, if we'd have just thought of this, maybe not, maybe you did it great, but
This one over here is extremely smart. She does her homework. I kind of just sit back and do the yes, dear, whatever you want, dear. It's
That's going to come in handy in the next few months, let me tell you.
I've been told
6
that
weeks.
Yes. She really did her homework, and when she said, hey, we're going to this Fertility Planet, I'm like, we're going to what? I had no clue. I didn't even know it existed. She knew a lot of the information already. And then we had a conversation with Dr. Diagarde while here. And then we heard her speak. And for me, she made the comment about voice and talking to somebody is really important. By being able to come to this conference and meet you guys, basically, from our doctor to where we got our sperm from, that's the best thing, especially for me. It doesn't matter if you think you know everything or you don't know everything, just reach out for those resources because you don't have to be a rocket scientist at this. You just have to know how to find the people. And this conference did that for us.
Also, I'd like to add, one of the things that, is really important is stress. And, I can only speak from personal experience. Our insurance did not cover any of the IVF or the sperm or anything. But for me, knowing what I know now, I would have skipped the IUI process. But I'm also 38, so at my age, it's an emotional process for a woman, I'll tell you. You get inseminated, it's that 2-week wait. I'm telling you, the 2-week wait is worse than this 10-month wait. It's emotional, and when you pee on that stick or get that blood test, it's very devastating, and you feel like a failure, and that's not the case. Like they said, 10 to 15% success rate in a perfect situation. So if you're going to go through the emotional, why not give your chance the best odds, And that's what, I got pregnant the first time through IVF. I think I was very lucky. I mean, we were planning on doing 2 or 3 at least. But for us, I would have just went straight to IVF.
Thank you. We have a couple minutes left. Are there any questions? I want to make sure that we get to some questions if anybody has anything at all. Okay. She shot up first.
I was just wondering, I think I didn't sense the majority of
So the question is about issues like schizophrenia that usually come on possibly later than the donors, even in our program. We do stay in touch with donors. We do medical and social updates with them about every 5 years. If something is diagnosed that we think is potentially a risk or an issue for not only current children, but if you have vials in storage, which is always an issue to think about, we can do a notification. It sort of varies case to case. There's no hard, fast rule on a specific issue versus a specific diagnosis, because it also has to do with the mother's medical history and other outside factors. We do maintain, and not just for schizophrenia, but for issues. Some of if our donor's 25, his dad may only be 45, and maybe there's going to be cancer, heart disease, other issues that we haven't yet heard about. And so as those develop, and sometimes there are genetic issues, so you choose a donor who is a recessive carrier or something, but it doesn't affect you or your child. However, a child's born affected somewhere else. We're going to let you know that if you have vials in storage, something you need to think about, because you may not know that you're a recessive carrier as well, and we want to make sure you're tested before you start on your second child. So it's a process. It's one of the reasons you want to go through a larger bank that has an infrastructure in place to support that ongoing relationship with both the donor and the clients.
And just to support that, I got a letter recently from you guys for one of my patients that we had a vial on that the donor, I think, was positive for, I forget which, I think it was SMA, genetic disorder, and we contacted the patient, and she had also been contacted. But it was great that you also send the letters to the doctors so that we know, but it ended up she didn't use that vial. But it's good to know.
Oh, well, I'm sorry we're out of time. You can come up to the booths. I'll be upstairs for the afternoon, and you guys are welcome to hang out too if you have questions, or right afterwards here. Thank you for joining us, and congratulations. We're so excited for you, and thank you all for being here. And thank you, Karen Thayer, and all the team here at Fertility Planet for putting on a great show. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott Brown. Thank you, Dr. Catherine Diagarde. Thank you, Diane Goodman, for being here. And thank you for the sponsor of the session, California Cryobank, for supporting this conversation on building your family with a sperm donor. We'd like to thank Fora.tv for live streaming and recording the programs. And thank you to our audience for joining. And also remember, there's a lot of great exhibits upstairs, so we want to make sure that you've seen them all. Thank you.